Brexit, the great NHS debate. Brexit is still capturing the headlines of most major news outlets nearly a year after the UK public voted to leave the European Union. It proved to be a referendum that split the entire country. Nearly 1 year later and a general election in between, the impact of Brexit on all aspects of life is still an unknown. One area of uncertainty in particular is the impact of Brexit on the NHS. During the build-up to the referendum, the now infamous Brexit battle bus caught the attention of many as the Leave campaign pledged to return £350 million in weekly payments back into the NHS from the EU. Once the referendum was completed and the British public had decided to leave the EU, one of the leading Leave campaigners, Nigel Farage, was interviewed about the claim on Good Morning Britain.
The £350 million a week we send to the EU, which we will no longer send to the EU, can you guarantee that's going to go to the NHS?
No, I can't, and I would never have made that claim.
17 million people have voted for Leave.
Yep.
I don't know how many people voted on the basis of that advert, but that was a huge part of the propaganda. You're now saying that's a mistake?
We have a £10 billion a year, a £34 million a day featherbed. That is going to be free money that we can spend on the NHS, on schools, or whatever it is.
But you're not guaranteeing that that money, as promised, will go to the NHS.
You must understand, I was ostracised by the official Leave campaign and as I've always done, did my own thing.
Nigel Farage did make it a clear point that he wasn't part of the official Leave campaign and thus accepted no responsibility for the claim, but did admit that it may have been a mistake. This does raise questions about what the official Leave campaigners' thoughts were on the claim that they had so strongly championed.
Jeremy Hunt, the Health Secretary, came in yesterday. He campaigned, of course, for us to remain in. He doesn't back up that pledge of £350 million for the NHS, and he's the man in charge of the NHS.
Well, what is absolutely true is that it's only if you have Theresa May conducting these negotiations, able to get the deal that Britain needs, that we have any chance of taking back control of our borders, of our laws, and indeed of huge sums of money. £350 million a week, which we currently do not control, and which, as I said just now in that clip,
it's not even going to be £350 million, is it?
From, I suppose it was last year, could be spent on our priorities, such as the NHS.
With both sides campaigning so aggressively, it's important to consider whether this figure is correct so the impact on the NHS longer term can be measured. In October 2017, the Office for National Statistics produced an article that looked at the contributions that the UK makes to the European Union. It highlighted the UK's total gross contribution to the EU was around £19 billion. The UK then receives a rebate of around £5 billion before any payments are made to the EU. Then approximately a further £5 billion of the total is returned back through investments and credits in both public and private sector. This funds schemes such as the Agricultural Guarantee and the Regional Development Fund. This leaves a total of around about £8.1 billion left that is then paid to the EU. As you can see from the breakdown of the contributions, the UK only pays the European Union £156 million on a weekly basis. While there is some room for error, it is not even close to the £350 million that was promised to the NHS during the campaigning. This is before we look at the NHS budget deficit. Currently, the NHS is predicted to have an approximate £13 billion funding gap by 2021 unless it makes savings of around 2 to 3% on top of its current cost-cutting measures. If we take into account the so-called extra funding of £350 million weekly investment in the NHS, it would take around 20 months to plug the predicted funding gap. This doesn't take into account the impact of Brexit on the economy and also the human element within the NHS. A government analysis report into Brexit was recently leaked and was released to the public. Chair of the Committee on Exiting the European Union, Hilary Benn, MP, said, "If the economy suffers, this in turn will have an impact on how much funding can then be allocated to the NHS. It could also affect the NHS's ability to exercise its cost-cutting measures, which are already having an impact on those using the NHS services and its staff. Less money in the economy means less money to fund the NHS, especially with existing pressures of waiting times, recovery rates and care quality. A recent survey by the British Medical Association revealed that nearly half of the EEA doctors are considering leaving leaving the UK following the referendum vote. This compares to 42% of doctors surveyed in February 2017. Among those considering leaving, more than a third have made plans to leave, meaning that almost 1 in 5 EU doctors have made plans to leave the UK since the Brexit vote. Change Europe recently published a report into how Brexit would affect the NHS and its current challenges. While the report looked at various impacts of Brexit, it most importantly looked into the specific impact of immigration changes to staffing levels in the NHS. We have already begun to see the issues around staffing in our services. The number of nurses from EU countries leaving the NHS increased to overtake the number of nurses coming into the NHS, leading to a shortfall of staff. Sean Duggan, Chief Executive of the Mental Health Network, said, "All these considerations highlight the complexities around Brexit and how it will impact the NHS after the UK leaves the European Union. Ultimately, the NHS faces tough times regardless, as it seeks to implement cost-cutting, tackle recruitment issues and deal with the increase of costs due to an ageing population and increasing costs in resources. The ongoing government negotiations will no doubt further add to the complications of existing issues already caused by Brexit. As the NHS turns 70, this year will no doubt be one of its toughest and most complicated as it looks ahead to Brexit in 2019.